Enjoy listening to this and other great podcasts from Jacob's Tent? Want even more content from us? Download the Jacob's Tent app today and gain access to the latest videos, teachings, and exclusive content all in one location. Stay connected and up to date with everything happening in the tent with the Jacob's Tent app, available on the App Store, Google Play, or wherever you find your apps.
Before Donald Trump was elected, he promised to put America first. In pursuit of that goal, he pledged to eliminate the U.S. trade deficit and promote domestic manufacturing by imposing tariffs on nations that he felt had taken advantage of America. The so-called tariff war has created quite a stir, causing the economic world to shudder. But in the last few days, there seems to have been a shift toward more cooperation among nations, prompting many to hope for peace and prosperity. And in this episode of the Weekly Scroll, we're going to explore the prophetic element of this issue and ask the question, are we on the brink of unprecedented prosperity, or are we standing at the threshold of something else?
Welcome to the Weekly Scroll, sharing biblical thoughts on current events. Scroll through today's top headlines with Bill Cloud as he unravels the political and spiritual implications of the world we live in, all through the lens of Scripture. Now, be encouraged, be challenged, and be ready.
Well, welcome again to the Weekly Scroll. Before Donald Trump was elected as president, he promised that in an effort to put America first, he would attempt to eliminate the U.S. trade deficit and promote domestic manufacturing by imposing tariffs on those nations he felt were taking advantage of the American consumer, saying the country was being, quote, ripped off by its trading partners. Now, these tariffs were also intended to hold nations like Mexico, Canada, and China accountable to halt illegal immigration into America from their countries and to stop fentanyl and other drugs from flowing into the United States. Now, as with most anything that President Trump puts forward, people either hate the idea or they think it's brilliant. And even those who felt it is the right move acknowledge that there are some short-term risks, some pain that this policy would cause, even if it proved to be successful. And those same people warned of the long-term risks if it fails. Many economists have warned that a tariff war could start a recession and create shortages on U.S. store shelves. Some go so far as to predict that a trade war would plunge the United States into a depression. But in the last week, it would seem that there has been a movement in the right direction, depending on how one sees this, with the announcement that the United States and China have reached an agreement to roll back most of their recent tariffs and to call a 90-day truce in the trade war for more talks on resolving their disputes. The Trump administration, of course, has imposed tariffs on several countries around the world, but its stand on China has been the most intense of them all. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bennett said this: the consensus from both delegations, referring to the United States and China, is neither side wants a decoupling. We want trade. We want more balanced trade. And I think that both sides are committed to achieving that. Now, in regard to the long-term effects of this agreement, a lot of it is going to depend on whether these two nations will find ways to bridge the gap between their differences during this 90-day suspension. Still, with the news that the United States has agreed to drop its tariff rate on Chinese goods to 30%, and China has agreed to lower its rate on United States goods to 10%, investors rejoiced and the stock markets rose very sharply. Oil prices surged, and the U.S. dollar gained against the euro and the Japanese yen. President Trump took to social media to comment on the matter, saying that China has agreed to, quote, open itself up to American business. According to Trump, this was perhaps the most significant development that stemmed from these trade negotiations. Referring to the trade restrictions that had been placed on Chinese imports, he said they have very few restrictions, that is the Chinese, and they didn't open their country to us. It's not fair. And now they've agreed to open China fully, and I think it's going to be fantastic. So this development comes just days after the U.S. and the U.K. signed a trade deal of their own, an agreement that Trump says includes billions of dollars of increased market access for American exports, especially in agriculture, dramatically increasing access for American beef and virtually all of the products produced by our great farmers. On the heels of this breaking news, President Trump headed to the Middle East to visit Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. The president's trip is intended to focus on these three oil-rich nations in an effort to align U.S. economic interest with potential business opportunities for American companies. In other words, even as one encouraging economic announcement has been made, Trump is off to negotiate other trade deals and try to arrange strategic partnerships that hold the potential for even greater economic prosperity. And as these negotiations in the Middle East get underway, no doubt other important issues pertaining to that region are going to be discussed, things like Gaza and, of course, Iran. And it's with that I want to focus on something that all of us need to keep in mind, and that is how events can turn on a dime. With all the talk of peace and prosperity, in other words, things like the release of the hostages from Gaza, Russia and Ukraine posturing as if they might come to some agreement, the United States and China agreeing to take a step back from this tariff war. With all this quote-unquote good news, we shouldn't be lulled to sleep by the dreams of peace and prosperity. Now, granted, there is absolutely nothing wrong with pursuing peace. Peace is a good thing. In fact, Messiah said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God." Likewise, there's nothing wrong with working hard and aspiring to prosper. Prosperity, in fact, can be a sign of God's blessing. The psalmist prayed this, "Save now, I pray, O Lord. O Lord, I pray, send now prosperity." Scripture invokes an appeal on behalf of those who pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper, that is, be at peace or be at rest. May they prosper who love you. Peace be within your walls, and prosperity, literally abundance, within your palaces. John the Apostle said, "I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health just as your soul prospers." The point is, peace, prosperity, that's a blessing, and it can be a sign of God's favor. But it's crucial to understand that it's not a guarantee of God's favor. In fact, where prosperity is concerned, it is no more a conclusive sign of God's approval than poverty is a conclusive sign of God's disapproval. Many righteous men and women have lived impoverished lives, at least by the world's standards. Likewise, many who have prospered according to the world's standards are as wicked as they come. As in every other matter, what we see on the outside isn't as important as what is on the inside. In other words, everything is a matter of the heart. Again, peace and prosperity can be evidence of God's blessing, but there is also the notion that, in some situations, peace and prosperity can be one of the last signs before trouble comes. In certain contexts, prosperity can be viewed as a warning sign of potential judgment, or at the very least, impending change. Prosperity may serve to speak to a deeper understanding of God's ways. In other words, highlighting the importance of gratitude, humility, and reliance on God's goodness, rather than on our own abilities and ingenuity. In other words, prosperity, safety, these kinds of things can be understood as a test as much as anything, and perhaps a warning of future consequences if we continue in disobedience. I want you to consider what Moses told Israel in regard to the manna that they were given in the wilderness. He said, "The Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and to test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. He fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone." Now let's face it, Prosperity oftentimes leads to complacency, and complacency oftentimes leads to downfall. That's because excessive wealth provokes us as human beings to focus on material possessions and at the expense of eternal values. The scripture is replete with such examples. Things like when Israel was about to enter the land of Canaan, God warned them that security and prosperity, in other words, the blessings that they would enjoy, would also become a snare to them. He predicted that because of their prosperity, they would turn away from him and from his ways, and then they would begin to pursue other interests and other gods. And in the end, they did just as he said, and exile was their lot. So it's important that in our pursuit of peace and abundance, that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And frankly, there is an inherent danger that comes with prosperity, which is when it is excessive and commonplace, like it is here in America, we tend to equate wealth with God's favor and even spiritual well-being. We grow accustomed to it to the point that we expect nothing less. Consequently, people begin to focus on pursuing and accumulating wealth, while at the same time neglecting other more important aspects of life, namely righteousness and intimacy with our Creator. In short, prosperity brings this risk that we begin to adore the blessing and begin to ignore the blesser. Prosperity often leads to pride and a sense of self-reliance, causing us to forget just how dependent on God we really are and that we really should be. So again, while peace and prosperity are wonderful, I'm all for it. It can be a blessing. If we aren't careful, the blessing can become a curse. Furthermore, I'm of the view that there have been times in history when prosperity was one of the last signs that God sent to a people just before he administered strict justice. I want you to consider this. Messiah likens the days that lead up to his return to the days of Noah, which are characterized as being somewhat normal, socially and economically anyway. He said they ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, as it was also in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. In other words, in the days leading up to Messiah's return, people will just be living life. And I want you to notice that according to his words, they'll be buying, selling, planting, building, in other words, prospering. But then destruction comes very suddenly. Destruction came to Sodom and Gomorrah and all the other cities of the plain very suddenly. And I want you to notice how the scripture described these cities and the society of that particular day. This was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw fit. So think about this. The sin that we so often associate with Sodom isn't mentioned directly. It's only hinted at. But what is specifically mentioned is that these cities had abundance of food, an abundance of idle time, both of which speak of prosperity. In the book of Revelation, Babylon, the great city, is described as having lived luxuriously, and that the merchants of the earth became rich through the abundance of her luxury. But the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, and as you read the text, it goes on to describe everything imaginable, including the bodies and souls of men. In other words, the Bible doesn't describe an impoverished city, but one that enjoyed abundance. Unfortunately, it lacked what was most important, and according to the prophecy, it will come to a swift and to a complete end. So suffice it to say, excessive prosperity tends to breed apathy, pride, and a disregard for the ways of God. Here's what Paul said to Timothy. The love of money, not money, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. And then as Moses warned Israel, if you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gained me this wealth, you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he swore to your fathers as it is this day. Then it shall be, if you by any means forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish. In other words, to pursue wealth and abundance to the degree that one becomes obsessed with it and then forgets the one who grants us prosperity is to invite foolishness and ruin. Again, there are so many stories in the scripture that attest to this fact. One such story is found in 1 Samuel, and it tells of a wealthy man by the name of Nabal. And there was an occasion when David's men had protected this man, Nabal, and his many flocks and his herds from different thieves and marauders. But when David needed his assistance, the man refused. Long story short, his wife learned of this, and then she went out to meet David and his men, who, by the way, were on their way to exact vengeance against Nabal. But she took sufficient provisions to feed David's men, which then tempered the king's wrath. And not long after this, the man Nabal, he died very suddenly, and his widow became David's wife. His name, Nabal, means fool. In Luke, Messiah taught a parable about a rich but foolish man whose farm yielded an abundance of fruit, so much so that the man felt the need to tear down his old barns and build larger barns. He told himself, "Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Speaking of the wicked, Job said, in prosperity, bashalom, literally, in wholeness, in peace, the destroyer or devastation and ruin comes upon him. The prophet Daniel, speaking of the king of fierce countenance, said, he shall destroy many in their prosperity. That Hebrew word means quietness or in their peace. Of course, Paul famously said, when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. In other words, Paul says that people will become so accustomed to peace and prosperity to the degree that they are lulled into a false sense of security, blinding them to the reality and the moral decay which they are a part of, and then become vulnerable to the destruction that comes upon them very suddenly. Now, I want to be very clear about something here. I am not against peace. I'm all for it. I'm all for pursuing peace. I don't want my children or my grandchildren fighting in a senseless war. If we're going to fight for something, let's let it be something that's worthwhile and righteous. I'm not against prosperity. I'm all for it. Certainly, we all want to prosper spiritually, but I'm all for prospering temporally too. And frankly, that is part of the blessing that is promised to those who obey the Lord faithfully. The issue I'm addressing here today is the world's obsession with peace and prosperity, but without acknowledging the need to walk humbly and obediently before our Creator. I'm not calling the president's motives into question. I choose to believe that the man has the best interest of the people he represents in mind. But we all must be careful not to be unhealthily consumed with the pursuit of prosperity and then fall into the trap that so many before us have stumbled into. And let's face it, as Americans, we are already predisposed to do just that. We already have every luxury at our fingertips, and still some of us want more. If, and I emphasize if, we are to experience America's golden age, as the president and others are touting, as followers of the Messiah, we need to be very careful not to allow dreams of a golden age to become a golden cup full of filthiness and abominations, like the one a certain harlot holds in her hand. Remember, God gives the power to get wealth that he may establish his covenant which he swore to your fathers. In other words, that through us, he may establish and advance his purpose in the earth. He doesn't give us wealth just so that we can tear down small barns and rebuild bigger ones, barns that we might not live long enough to appreciate. And so in regard to prosperity, like I said, I'm all for it. But as the Lord purposes and as the Lord allows, as it is written, honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increase, so your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. In regards to peace and security, the scripture says you will keep him in perfect peace. That Hebrew phrasing there is shalom, shalom. It's doubling the word shalom. You will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for in Yah, the Lord, is everlasting strength. And so then, yes, let us pursue peace. Let us pursue prosperity. But let's make certain that our hearts and minds remain focused on him as our main pursuit before all things. And let us always look to him as the source of our peace and our prosperity and everything that pertains to life.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to get the latest updates from Bill and check out other podcasts available from Jacob's Tent. And join us next week on The Weekly Scroll.